And then the 4 types of literature are, there are letters, and we do a lot of that at Bentry. We read Ephesians. We're doing this year Ephesians. It's a letter that Paul wrote to churches. Another letter is Hebrews. The New Testament's full of a lot of letters. That's one type of literature. Another type of literature is history. The book of Acts is a history of the first church. In the Old Testament, the book of Genesis gives us that foundation for all those characters that our faith has been built on. So history is the second kind. The third kind is prophetic literature, and that's Revelation is a great example. In the New Testament, Revelation is a prophecy of what's to come. In the Old Testament, Daniel is an example. There are other books too, but those are examples of prophecy. And then the fourth kind is what we call is poetry. And there are 5 poetry books. So as we talk about literature, there are 4 types, and then there are, did I say 5? 5 types of poetry. And poetry goes up here. So poetry in general, there are 5 types. Is that right? Poetry. 3 types. Sorry, I'm getting my numbers mixed up. First one is lyrics. And being a person that's into music, I understand lyrics are the words that we put to music. So think of a book in the Bible that does that. Psalms, exactly. Psalms were written to be put to music. So, and if you have any, boy, this is a great way to learn Scripture, is to get Scripture. A lot of people have put the words of Scripture to music. That's a wonderful way to memorize Scripture. And especially Psalms. I've had several CDs that have Psalms that are put to music. It's a great way to remember that poetry. Another type of literature that's poetical is dramatic. And think about acting something out. That's a narrative that's actually conveying a story in poetic form. So think of a dramatic presentation, Song of Solomon. You know, when you think of that, it's like a whole story, but it's really figurative. It's really difficult to understand. That's a type of poetry. Then the other type is the instructional, and that's what we have in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs are, for the most part, there's some poems, some poetry that are a little longer, but there are many very short 1 or 2 or 3 sentence lines that teach us. It's instructional poetry. So we're going to talk about 3 types, and then we focus on instructional. And it's Proverbs. Okay. Now within the poetry types, there are also poetry techniques. So we've talked about types. Now we want to talk about techniques of poetry. This is very important as we think about what are we reading when we read these statements that are in Proverbs. When I think of poetry, I think of Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. That's, lost me. There we go. English poetry. Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. Everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. It rhymes. That's a key thing in English poetry. Another thing, I don't know if you noticed, in that same verse, there's a cadence. There's a way that it flows. And if you counted the verses, Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow, there are 13 syllables. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. 13 more syllables. So see how it lines up. That's intentional. Whoever wrote that poem did that intentionally. They had to craft those words so that it created a rhyme and a meter. Now, Hebrew poetry doesn't do that so much. And even if it did, we'd lose it because it's translated. Okay? That's part of the problem with the difficulty in understanding is we don't read Hebrew. We're reading this in English. A translator's already gone in and tried to convey as closely as possible what that actually says. It doesn't always come across in the way that the Hebrews actually read this. Now, and so what you need to understand too about Hebrew poetry is that it's written in parallelism. Okay, let me write that word. Parallelism. Okay, very important concept. And that's when there are couples or pairs of statements that are meant to be read together, sometimes even 3 of them. And You've got in the front section, the introduction of your book. I'm not going to go into this because it talks about it there. So just read the introduction before your first lesson, and you'll get some good examples of parallelism. The book of Proverbs is full of this. And as we learn to skillfully apply the knowledge that we're reading in the book of Proverbs, we need to remember not to neglect the parallelism. It's very important to, okay, what's the first phrase? And then find the second phrase and put them together, because you're going to need both of those phrases to really understand. So as we apply this and try to interpret what Proverbs means, we need to take in the whole statement. So parallelism is one thing. Another thing that we need to be aware of in Hebrew poetry is figures of speech. And another way of saying that is figurative language. Okay, now as we dig into all this detail of poetry, don't you just wish that God would have just told us? Okay, don't do that, do this. Right? It'd be a lot simpler, right? It tends to be why we like the letters, that type of literature in the New Testament. We like those letters because they're pretty much doing that. Don't do this, but do this. Poetry doesn't do that. We have to dig a little harder, and especially because it's a different language, we have to really kind of wade through what is the intention here of this author. So I asked myself, okay, why did God inspire writers who do poetry to put poetry in this book? If God is trying to reveal himself to us here and teach us things, why did he make it so hard? Well, the answer to that is that when he revealed himself to the Hebrew writer who wrote here, it wasn't quite as difficult for the audience to understand. So we've got it's time that's a problem, and it's also the language that's a problem. As I considered that, I thought, I wonder how often do we use figurative language? So let me give you an example of that. I'm going to put this scarf up here. What did I just do with the scarf? I draped it, I hung it on here. Okay, it's another way of saying draping. All right, so that's how I would define this. Draping something over or laying it across is hanging. So if I were to define hang to you, I could use this as a visual example of it. That seems pretty clear, right? Now, what if I walked up to Mary and said, you know what, Mary? I think you're a little uptight. I think you need to hang loose. Okay? And then I think that later we need to go hang out. Okay? Next week, if you look really closely, you might want to be aware of me, because maybe I'd be coming with a hangover. Okay? What else about me? So you see what's happening. We have this thing that's very clear. It's a very, very clear visual of hang. We all understand that definition. But as we get into the specifics of our English language, look how many different ways we use that word. That's one word. Multiply that by how many different words. If we thought about what we say, a lot of what we say, and people that are learning, this table over here, you've learned probably another language, a lot of you. How difficult is it when you're trying to learn English and you come across these things that are figurative? I need to go hang out. Wait a minute, I thought it meant draping over. Hang out, what's that? It's hanging over, pretty much, is what I see. And it's like that in other languages too. It was like that in the Hebrew language. So when God inspired writers of poetry to write and give his message to us, it was natural for poets to be able to convey their figurative language, and in that culture, they pretty much understood it. When I say hangover, hang out, hang in there, y'all are with me. If you're English speakers, you get it, because it's so normal to us. But for those that are second language folks, and as we go into another culture and learn their language, that's a little more difficult to learn all the variations on a theme of hanging, right? So, but what it does, when I say hangover, in one word, you all have a mental picture of what that is, don't you? Yeah? And I bet you could stand up right now and give me 5 sentences of what would describe a person who has a hangover. Someone who's had too much to drink the night before. They're coming in with a headache, probably. They probably have bloodshot eyes, maybe slurred speech, right? Maybe if it's recent, maybe if they just have been drinking, you might even be able to, the sense of